Welcome back. We're talking about international policy under US President Barack Obama. And joining us now from London is Nadim Shehadi, an associate fellow on the Middle East with the Chatham House Royal Institute of International Affairs. From Brussels, Gustaaf Geeraerts, a professor of international relations at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel, and in Beijing, a current affairs commentator and the director of the China National Association of International Studies, Victor Gao. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Victor Gao, let me start with you. What is your assessment of President Obama's recent trip to Asia? Did he achieve his two objectives? On the one hand, reassuring allies that the United States will stand by them, and on the other, not alienating China?
Well, first of all, from the Chinese perspective, we attach a great deal of importance to the China-US relations. After all, this is the most important bilateral relations in today's world. However, also from the Chinese perspective, what President Obama said in Tokyo and in Manila was considered highly destabilizing and not very constructive. Why? Mainly because China is actually a force for peace and stability in this part of the world. And there are territorial disputes between China and Japan on the one hand, and China and the Philippines on the other hand. China has always asked for peaceful negotiation and diplomacy. On Japan's side, they even refuse to recognize there is a territorial dispute involving Diaoyu Island. Therefore, for President Obama to become a greater statesman, to really exercise American leadership, he needs to put pressure on Tokyo to recognize there is a territorial dispute between China and Japan over Diaoyu Island and urge Japan to come back to the negotiation table with China. This is the most constructive way to solve the territorial dispute between China and Japan. And the United States can apply similar pressure to the Philippines so that China and the Philippines can engage with each other in the diplomatic negotiation of the territorial dispute between them.
Okay, we'll return to that issue in a moment, but let me go to Nadim Shehadi in London. Nadim,
hello.
The Middle East has always been a focus of successive US administrations insofar as foreign policy is concerned, and that is mainly because of the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But when we look at the efforts of this particular administration, Secretary of State John Kerry has made several visits to the region, but even after extensive negotiations with the Israelis, with the Palestinians, he's got nothing to show for it. So has he perhaps spent too much time on this issue and perhaps too much political capital as well?
Well, this administration's Middle East policy is not only confined to the Palestinian-Israeli issue. There's the negotiations with Iran, and there's the relations with the Gulf countries, as well as the policy towards Syria. And what I think the Obama administration suffers from is a problem of communication. It does not project enough power, and it has lack of credibility. So this makes its allies in the region, or those who look up to it for solutions, feel disappointed, and its adversaries in the region feel they can take advantage of that projected weakness from the administration.
All right, let's go to Gustaaf Geeraerts in Brussels. Gustaaf, what is the view from the rest of Europe, the broad view of the way the United States is conducting foreign policy at the moment? I mean, as we heard from Nadim Shehadi just a moment ago, it appears to be weak, indecisive, vacillating. Is that the view from the rest of Europe as well?
I think that if you look in general to Obama's foreign policy, that it's clear that he attempts to adapt American foreign policy to conditions that have fundamentally changed. First of all, there is a domestic environment which is less willing to support adventurous American foreign policies. On the other hand, America is dealing with an international environment which is fundamentally changing, and in a sense, America is slowly but certainly adapting to its relative decline in influence. And I think that will become more visible also in the future. So you see on the one hand an attempt to reassure the allies, on the other hand also the demand that allies should take more care themselves of their security, so there will be more pressure on burden sharing in the future.
But European countries also have other challenges. I mean, there has been this call from the United States for European NATO allies to increase their defense budgets, for instance. Are these countries going to increase their defense budgets, or do they have other priorities?
Yeah, but in Europe, it's very clear that as a result of America's pivot to Asia, that there has been some uncertainty and worry about America's commitment to Europe. But on the other hand, it's also very clear that European publics are not very much in support of increasing budgets. The European governments are all facing financial problems, economic problems, and these are regarded as the priorities for governments to deal with. So I think, okay, there will be more stress on burden sharing, but I'm not so sure whether it will come forward.
Okay, let's go back to Victor Gao in Beijing. Victor, there is a perception, and we see it in the press very often, that American policy, insofar as China is concerned, is to contain Chinese power, Chinese growth. I mean, you mentioned earlier on that President Obama made statements in Tokyo and in the Philippines, which could be seen as destabilizing in that part of the world, in Southeast Asia, in China. Is the United States, in your view, trying to contain Chinese power, Chinese growth?
First of all, even though the United States is the only surviving superpower in the world today with the strongest military, for a country of 300 million to try to contain a population of 1.3 billion is ludicrous. Secondly, the Chinese economy and the United States economy are highly integrated with each other. China is the largest creditor nation to the United States, and thousands of American companies, big and small, are operating in China. For Kentucky Fried Chicken, for example, the China market is probably the largest market, larger than that in the United States. Therefore, such talk about containment against China is not only unrealistic, but also self-destructive. This shows that many people here in Washington, D.C., there is a lack of understanding of the reality here in China, and also it shows the arrogance, which probably is more destructive of American leadership than otherwise. Therefore, I think between China and the United States, the only way going forward is to engage each other as partners rather than enemies against each other. And China has no intention of becoming hostile or antagonistic to the United States, but China will no longer be bullied, and China does not enjoy such humiliation from the United States. And it is time for the United States to wake up and try to reach out to China, engage China as a partner going forward. This will make the world we live in a better world for both of us as well as for mankind.
Nadim Shehadi in London, you mentioned earlier that when you look at foreign policy in the Middle East, US foreign policy in the Middle East, it would appear that the United States is weak, that it's very defensive in its policy. There is also a perception here in the United States as well as in other parts of the world that the Middle East is no longer a priority for the United States, and that we see with its pivot to Asia, its rebalancing as it's caused. Do you believe that to be the case, that the Middle East is no longer a priority?
Well, that's the policy, the declared policy of the administration of shifting emphasis towards Asia. But I think that evaluating foreign policy of the United States has to be an overall evaluation of how it fits together, and I think the projection of weakness in the Middle East is reflected in the way that the United States is seen in other parts of the world, including in Asia and by Russia. When the United States loses credibility, when President Obama loses credibility, it encourages conflicts in other regions. People take advantage of it, exactly like President Putin is doing now in Ukraine.
Gustaaf Geeraerts, let's look at United States policy towards Russia, especially in the wake of the crisis in Ukraine. The United States has responded to this by imposing sanctions together with its European partners on certain individuals in Russia, on certain financial institutions in Russia. But do you believe that the EU and the United States are on the same page when it comes to what action should be taken against Russia?
On a general level, they may be on the same page. They have, of course, both criticized Russia's behavior, but when it will come to forceful action, so action which goes further than what they have done so far, I think it will be more difficult because for one, you know, the relationship between Europe and Russia is of a different kind than the one between the United States and Russia. Russia is Europe's third trading partner. Europe is Russia's first trading partner. Also, Europe receives 24% of its natural gas from the Soviet Union, from Russia, sorry. So it's, you know, a much more difficult situation. Also, 75% of foreign direct investment in Russia is from European origin. So you see that in the case of Europe, there is, it's much more difficult to you know, go in the direction of forceful action. And yeah, you see that by the hesitation on the part of Germany, for instance, who tries to find ways to avoid, you know, severe sanctions.
Okay, gentlemen, we have to take a break right now, but we will be back. We'll have more with our panel when the heat continues. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion about the international policies of the United States under President Obama with Nadim Shehadi in London, Gustaaf Geeraerts in Brussels, and Victor Gar in Beijing. Welcome to all of you again. Nadim Shehadi, let me start with you this time. You were very critical of U.S. policy in Syria on how the U.S. is handling the civil war there in Syria. In fact, you said that it was weak and it called for much stronger action. President Obama has come under criticism from other quarters as well, insofar as Syria is concerned, here in the United States and around the world. But he defended his position during a recent news conference. Let's watch what he said.
I would note that those who criticize our foreign policy with respect to Syria, they themselves say, no, 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 we don't mean sending in troops. Well, what do you mean? Well, you should be assisting the opposition. Well, we're assisting the opposition. What else do you mean? Well, perhaps you should have taken a strike in Syria to get chemical weapons out of Syria. Well, it turns out we're getting chemical weapons out of Syria without having initiated a strike. So what else are you talking about? And at that point, it kind of trails off.
So, Nadim, the point the president there is making that he has achieved his foreign policy objectives in Syria without the use of force. Does he have a point?
Well, yes, I think the point here is that President Obama doesn't get it. He doesn't get what his credibility means in the region. He doesn't get what he projects in the region. He's not really assisting the opposition. He's, in a way, assisting the regime because he's given the green light to the regime to continue crushing the opposition. When President Obama sets a red line and doesn't abide by it, it projects, it gives, in a way, it gives a green light to the regime to continue crushing the opposition. And that, I think, is the bottom line.
Okay, let's go back to Victor Gar in Beijing and look at Chinese foreign policy. And Victor, is China looking at some kind of new alliance with Russia? There's been a report in the South China Morning Post which says that China and Russia will stage a naval drill in the sensitive East China Sea at the end of this month. A move, analysts say, could be aimed at showing their displeasure over Washington's policies regarding the Diaoyu Islands and Ukraine. So, is that a change in Chinese foreign policy?
No, first of all, China and Russian relations are probably at the best period historically. and the two countries respect each other as equals, and there has been a lot of partnership and strategic cooperation. And I think now that Russia is facing more and more sanctions by the United States and Western European and Western countries over the Ukrainian crisis, there will be no doubt that Russia will have a more reason to lean more towards China. Now, there will be no military alliance between China and Russia. Both countries defend fiercely their independence in this regard. However, naval exercise or joint military exercise probably will happen very often. The two countries are important members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has a very important mandate of fighting against terrorism,
right,
separatism, extremism in Central Asia. Therefore, I think it is to be expected that the military cooperation in this area, as well as in East China Sea and South China Sea, will go up in the coming months and years.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how significant these exercises are, because it comes at a time when the United States is calling for Russia's isolation.
China does not agree with the United States on the sanctions. As a matter of fact, the Chinese government has urged the United States not to impose sanctions in the belief that sanctions actually don't help in a situation like this. And the better way is to engage with each other through diplomacy and earnest negotiation. And as far as the Ukrainian situation is concerned, China is urging all parties to engage in a national reconciliation rather than escalation. And therefore, I think China will continue to engage with Russia regardless of the sanctions imposed by the United States and Western powers.
Okay, Gustaaf Geeraerts, would Europe like to see more engagement with Russia, more United States engagement with Russia, rather than Washington calling for the isolation of Moscow?
But I think it's always preferable to have a negotiated solution, but apparently the two parties are moving away from each other and seem to have a problem of communication. It's quite obvious that a military solution to the problem is out of the question, but of course now the situation seems to be deteriorating. And if it would come to a Russian invasion, of course, we would be in a very, very difficult situation.
Is the view from Europe that in the future we are going to see very much a bipolar world? You're going to see two superpowers, the United States and China, and then we would have the rest of the world, including Europe?
No, I think the picture is somewhat more complicated. We definitely will move to a kind of multi-layered polarity where you will have United States and China as the first-tier actors, so to speak. But on the second tier, you have a number of countries which are, not strong enough in terms of comprehensive power, but too important to be left aside. And what we will see is a very complicated system where it's very important that all concerned parties remain in good communication. And yeah, I think that the EU-China relationship might maybe figure as a kind of an example to bring about such a kind of new cooperation, a new kind of concert, if you wish.
Okay, Victor Gao, let me go to you in Beijing. How do you see relations between the United States and China unfold in the years ahead? Do you see these relations improving, or are there going to be more disputes, especially over territorial issues?
Personally, I'm actually very optimistic about the overall trend of the China-US relations in the coming years. In a matter of years' time, China's economy will be larger than the United States, and the Americans have to learn to deal with China as the largest economy and will eventually show China due respect in this regard. Having said that, I think from the Chinese perspective, there is no desire or intention at all to be hostile or antagonistic against the United States. China wants to continue to engage the United States as a partner for mutual benefit. And if China and the United States can become partners with each other, the world will be better off, and international issues can be more easily resolved. Therefore, for the United States, engaging China in a more constructive way is not only good in itself, but is also beneficial to the United States.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Gustaaf Geeraerts in Brussels, thanks for joining us. Victor Gao in Beijing as well, and Nadim Shehadi in London. Unfortunately, we lost that link to London, but thanks for your participation. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. Once again, that's theheat@cctv-america.com. I'm Anand, Naidoo in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.